Hello, hello, hello. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. Today we will be reviewing CDFM Module 1, Competency 3, Management's Responsibility for Enterprise Risk Management and Internal Control. So the idea behind this chapter is us understanding that every decision we make, there is a risk associated with it. So enterprise risk management now is identifying what those risks are. That's your ERM portion of it. And then the internal control side of it is putting measures in place to manage the risk. So in the previous study, guys, I think maybe 2013, it used to just be internal controls. And then they later added on the risk assessment piece of it. So we're going to start on page 135. As you will see, they give you the definition or the background of the difference between enterprise risk management and internal control. And if you've been associated with the government long enough, you should be familiar with risk management process, because that's all it is. It's being able to identify your risk, assess them, determine what controls you can put in place to mitigate the risk and to reduce and manage the impact of those risks. So that's your ERM. That's the overarching governance body or framework that is used to identify and assess risk. And in that same paragraph, it talks about internal controls. And internal control are the processes put in place by the organization, by the oversight body, to help to meet those objectives within your organization with some type of reasonable assurance that the result that you're giving, the data that you're giving out to your hire, you have confidence that it's the correct information. Because you'll see with internal controls, you have internal controls of not just our day-to-day processes, but even of our financial system. Because what we always say with dealing with money, garbage in means garbage out. If you put the information into the system incorrectly, the result you're going to get is incorrectly. So what measures do you have in place to ensure that your status of fund is correct? You have to have backup checks to manage that. So just kind of read through those paragraphs, but definitely the first one, because it explains the difference between ERM and internal control. They kind of go hand in hand, because that's what you're doing really in internal control, is you are identifying issues that you may run into, risk, and then you're putting measures, separation of duties in place. You're putting these different measures in place to mitigate. So that's what you're actually doing. And so we're going to look at the bottom of page 6 and page 7, the different laws, policies, and regulations that talks about ERM and internal control. So it was the Federal Managers Financial Integrity Act of 1982 that established the requirement for organizations to have internal control measures in the federal government. Federal Managers Financial Integrity Act of 1982. Just say it all together with the year in there, so it'll be easier for you to recall. So internal control. And then the Office of Management and Budget on top of page 7, that's OMB. They took that law, the Federal Managers Financial Integrity Act of 1982, and then they published the OMB Circular A123. You need to know the difference between OMB Circular A123 and the other one we covered. What's the other circular we covered? See if anybody caught it from the last couple of weeks. When we talked about the budget process, budget formulation, budget execution, that is OMB Circular A11. So anytime you hear A11, you're talking about budget processes, formulation, execution, everything budget related. When you hear OMB Circular A123, you know you're dealing with internal controls. And the 1, 2, 3 behind it should make it easy to recall. So based on the FMFIA law, the OMB implemented that internal control policy, OMB Circular A123, within the executive branch. So don't forget, Department of Defense falls under the executive branch. Our budget comes from the executive branch because that's the president's budget, PresBud. So all of that ties back in together. And then the second to last one, the FIA also required the GAO, which who does the GAO work for? Anybody? Who does GAO? Government Accountability Office. Who do they work for?
Congress.
They work for Congress. Thank you, sir. And so they're an external auditing agency that works for Congress. They do the audits on the executive branch to make sure that we're following the rules established by Congress. And so in the FMFIA Act, it required the GAO to also provide us with a standard for internal control. So, and we'll go through that within the study guide. They have various standards. So even when we go through the audit, I think it's module 3 or wherever, module 3 is don't forget internal control, because internal control is your first line of defense. An audit is typically an external organization coming in to evaluate you. Internal control are those measures you put in place yourself. And so the GAO information on internal control may be found in the GAO Red Book. Within the CDFM, you're going to look at the GAO Green Book, the GAO Yellow Book, and the GAO Red Book. So if you think of those colors, the best way I associate them is with a stoplight. Red, yellow, green. Red deals with appropriation, yellow is auditing, and the green is internal control. Red, yellow, green, stoplight, appropriation, auditing, internal control. No, it's not on the page. So everything I say is not going to be on the page in front of you, but it's information that is associated with what is in front of you. All right, so you have the law, the Federal Managers Financial Integrity Act of 1982, OMB, which is our higher resource manager. They give us guidance in OMB Circular A123 on internal control and risk management. And then you have the GAO that gives us the GAO Green Book on internal control. And then at the DoD level, it also provides internal control guidance in the DoD 5010.40. I always point this out. Make sure you know that it's the 5010 is 0.40 behind it. Because if you see it again, it might say 0.20, 0.30, 0.40, 0.50, which is the DoD instruction or DoD regulation on internal control is 0.40. I think it's the only DoD that we really focus on within the study guide anyway. So the DoD instruction is primarily on the internal control part of it. But again, if you think about internal control, you are actually doing both. You're assessing the risk and you're putting measures in place to mitigate and manage those risks. So any question on the laws, the regulations, the policies associated with internal control? So then why do we have internal control? Because once Congress appropriates the funds, we get our allotment. Why do we need internal control measures in place? And we could do whatever we want with those funds, right?
Check and balances, ma'am.
Check and balances because there are guidelines on those funds. Power of the purse. That's why you have to have a GAO, because we know that human beings, if we don't monitor, if we don't put guidelines, we're going to do what we want with those funds. So to prevent the fraud, waste, and abuse, we put controls in place, internal controls, to make sure that we are utilizing the resources that we were given in a proper manner. All right, so they go into more detail. If you want to read more detail on the OMB Circular A123, begins on page 139. In 10, they give you the formal definition of ERM again. Should be no different than what we already went over. The value of risk management, and especially if you've been in uniform, we do risk assessment pretty much for every exercise. So you've done this extensively. It's the same type of idea. The risk management steps are on page 11. The reason I'm glancing over them, you still need to read through this information, but again, I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time on it. All right, something that's unfamiliar to some is the top of page 12, 1 through 12, risk profile. Because you got risk profile and then you have a risk register. So within the OMB Circular A123, that means OMB requires that each agency have a risk profile. And then we're going to look at the purpose of it. So the second paragraph, the primary purpose of the risk profile is an analysis of the different risks within that agency that agency may face, and then the objectives that arise and the activities and how you mitigate the risk. And so it's kind of like having a storage area for all the risks that is considered at that level, agency level. So the risk profile. The risk profile assists in facilitating determination around the level of types of risk, right? Now, if you keep reading, you'll also see, I think like the last sentence of that second paragraph, the risk profile differs from a risk register. And this is the only place you're going to see that register listed. In that, it is a prioritized inventory of the most significant risk identified and assessed through risk assessment, versus the inventory is just a list of all types of risk. So risk profile has the most significant. All right, let me make sure I read that. Yeah, of the most significant risk, and then you have the risk inventory is all the different risks. Any question on the differences there? And I pointed out because I said that's the only little spot where it's written that I found it, that information. Page 1 through 13, again, definition of internal control from the GAO Green Book. All right, so the GAO Yellow Book talks about what? Recap. So with this information, you always got to recap. What's the GAO Yellow Book talk about?
Auditing.
Auditing. Okay, and what about the Red Book?
Appropriation.
Appropriations. So anything you need to know, if you want to know what O&M is used for, you go to the GAO Red Book. All right, and then here we talk about internal control is the GAO Green Book. A lot of it, bunch of information. They talk about on page 15, at the top there, we deal with financial systems, so you have internal control over financial systems. And they kind of go over some of that, but nothing to point out. A lot of it is repetitive. If you notice on page 1 through 17, more in depth in the Green Book, they kind of give you a snippet of what it says in the GAO Green Book and how it's broken down in the 4 sections. All right, so the meat and potatoes of this section is on page 19, starts on page 19. The GAO standards. All right, so what was the law that required the GAO to establish these internal control standards for us to use? Anybody can answer. What is the standard? What is the law that required the GAO to establish these internal control standards? You say that was, go ahead.
Principles of Federation Appropriations Law? Sorry, no.
No, ma'am. No, ma'am. All right, try again. Give her a lifeline. All right, let me repeat it to make sure I'm saying it correctly. What is the law that required the GAO, because we're on page 19, it talks about GAO internal control standards. So what is the law that required the GAO to come up with these 5 standards? And when you're studying, that's what I want you to do, is to keep recapping, to make sure you're tying what you just learned in the beginning of this same section. The Federal Managers Financial Integrity Act of 1982 required the GAO to establish internal control measures or principles. So that's the FMFIA. Yeah. So the 5 GAO standards are control environments, and I think we're going to go through each one a little bit, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. And within all of that framework, there's 17 internal control principles that fall under each. So what I've identified in older study guides, they did not have those principles underneath them. So starting on page 20, all they had was the 5 standards. Well, now you have to read those principles, because I have individuals that come back and say, yeah, they listed a principle and then they asked you which GAO principle, which standard does this fall under? And so you need to read it. And they're pretty straightforward. Controlling the environment. And you think about it, as if you're the boss, the manager, the supervisor, controlling the environment. What are the principles involved? Oversight body should demonstrate a commitment to integrity. Okay, if I'm the supervisor, I need to have integrity, ethical values. That's what I'm promoting. The oversight body should oversee the entity's oversight of the internal control program. Management should establish an organizational structure, assign responsibility, delegate authority. Those are all the key words. So think about all of that means controlling the environment. Management should demonstrate a commitment to recruit, develop, and retain competent individuals. They're trained and competent. And number 5, management should evaluate performance and hold individuals accountable for their internal control responsibilities. So all of those, if you think about them, they all say controlling an environment. So any of those 5 can fall under that. The next part is risk assessment. And you have to read it, because I think one of these, it kind of throws you and you're like, that's risk assessment? Management should define objectives clearly to enable the identification of risk. So if the question is, management clearly defines objectives, then you should know, because you have clear definition of your objectives, it will then help you to identify risk. So you need to put it in your own words. If you're trying to figure out, is that a control activity, or like this says, it's a risk assessment. So clearly defined objective is a risk assessment principle. Management should identify, analyze, and respond to risk. So anytime you got the word risk in there, most likely falls under risk assessment. But look at number 8. Management should consider the potential for fraud. But that's what risk assessment is. What are the potential of fraud, waste, and abuse occurring. And number 9, management should identify, analyze, and respond to significant changes that could impact the internal control system. Those 4 are all risk assessment. So I'm taking my time with these because, again, that's how you're being tested, not just knowing, hey, which one is not a GAO standard, and you just list the 4 or the 5 that is. Then you need to also know what principles fall under which one. Because if I say management should use quality information to achieve the entity's objective, and I ask you which GAO standard that falls under, you got to be able to answer it. All right, so let's go to page 1321, control activities. So not only you control the environments by the structure you put in place, now you're controlling specific activities. So management should design control activities to achieve objectives and respond to risk. So even though the word risk is in it, you're responding to the risk based on the activity you put in place. Number 11, management should design the entity's information system and related control activities to achieve objectives and respond to risk. Again. And number 12, management should implement control activities through policy. So policy letters, that's a control activity. Information and communication. So I guess, let me see if I can ask. Let me go through all of them first, then I ask my question. All right, information and communication. Number 13, management should use quality information to achieve the objective. 14, management should internally communicate the necessary quality information to achieve its objective. So all of this have information in it. Management should externally communicate. So you communicate internally and externally the necessary quality information to achieve objective. So you should be able to find all the ones dealing with information and communication. And then monitoring. Management should establish and operate monitoring activities to monitor the internal control system, right? So oversight. And then management should remediate, identify internal control deficiencies. So you identify the deficiencies and fix them within a timely manner. That's all part of monitoring. All right, so what are separation of duties? Meaning I shouldn't be the one inputting a transaction, certifying and approving the same transaction all the way through. That's called separation of duties. Under which GAO standard do you think that will fall? Okay. Because I would hope that you all have separation. Either somebody input it and then the supervisor certifies it or approves it. Go ahead.
Would it be control activities?
Control activities. Perfect. Could it fall under something else? Now that I've gone through all of them, I would pick control activities, because activities are those specific tasks that you implement to ensure that you control the processes, you control your operation, you respond to the risk associated with it, whereas control environment is just the type of people that you actually hire, the personnel that you put into place. You hold people accountable. Those is as the environment that you set. So any question on the GAO standards? I call them standards, even though they say framework for internal control, which is the GAO Green Book. Those are the 5 components and 17 principles. So make sure you go back over those so you know how to place them within those principles. All right, page 1323 talks about categories of reporting of internal control deficiencies. So if you have a control deficiency, a significant deficiency, a material weakness. So really it's just reading these to understand the definition of what they are. A control deficiency exists when the design, implementation, or operation of a control does not allow management in the normal course of performing their duties to achieve the objective to address the risk. That is an internal action that is reported. When you continue reading, you'll see it's internal within the organization. Something is a control deficiency, meaning every step of the process that we have in place to mitigate that risk cannot be reached. So we have a control deficiency. We can control it. If we cannot control it, it's called a significant deficiency. Could be a combination of several deficiencies. In internal control that is less severe than a material weakness, yet it's important enough to merit attention. The key there is that a significant deficiency is also reported internally within the organization. So you don't have to notify your higher command. And progress against corrective action plan must be periodically assessed. So you know it's a problem, but you've addressed it. You all have checks and balances in place, and you have periodic checks to make sure that we still have it under control. Now, the third one is reported externally to your higher if it's considered a material weakness. And a material weakness is significant enough that the agency determines that it needs to be reported outside of the agency. Whenever they say agency in the study guide, they're talking at the DoD level. So something is a material weakness, it's at the DoD level, they deem that they need to report it to OMB. Does everyone understand that? And it's listed in that paragraph, the third bullet. So control and significant deficiencies are worked internally, and material weakness is reported from the agency head or the Department of Defense to OMB. Meaning no matter what at their level that we do, we cannot assure that reasonable assurance. And it must be reported to Congress through the AFR. So they throw some acronym, and I think that's the first time. Yeah, we're going to talk about it, but the AFR is the Agency Financial Report, and the PAR is the Performance and Accountability Report. It'll be on page 25 is where it starts. So you got to be careful when you're studying, when they just throw some acronym out there, make sure you know what they are. So under material weakness, how the agency head notifies OMB and Congress is by using the AFR and the PAR or other management reports. All right, so let's go. Let me find it. So let's start on page 25 at the very top. Those two reports are listed there in your corrective plan. So he talks about a summary of the corrective action plan for material weaknesses that have not been fully mitigated at the time of reporting must be included in the agency financial report, performance, and accounting. So that's kind of repeating the same thing, but now you see it in writing. All right, page 27, DoD material weakness. So we got 4 levels that are considered. At the DoD level, that's the SecDef, cannot be resolved by the Secretary of Defense. It could be a material weakness at the component level. When a weakness exists within the Department of Defense or at one or more of its major commands or activities requiring DoD component attention. You have the major command or field activity level. That means a weakness exists throughout that major command or under its several installations or its installation. So if you look at it, you can start with installation, then you go to the major command, and the major command falls under the component falls under Department of Defense. So those are the 4 levels of DoD material weakness. That means no matter what they do, even if they follow the SOP, they cannot mitigate the risk completely. There's still some residual risk that they could not control. So there's a reporting requirements. We're going to look at it in a little bit. Reporting on internal control based on OMB Circular A123. There's an annual assurance statement. Some of you may be familiar with it. And we're going to look at what's built into it. And you have to explain your integration of the ERM and internal control and what measures you have in place. On the bottom of page 28, it tells you when those reports are due. DoD components are required to submit their annual statement of assurance to OSD by 1 October each year. Then the DoD submits the annual statement of assurance to OMB by 15 November. So that's something important for you to highlight there. So 1 October for the subordinates to DoD, and then DoD to OMB is by 15 November. So in the report, the contents of the report, DoD and OSD statement of assurance. Number 3, so there's 3 classification of assurance. There's the unmodified, so you're going to need to know the definition, the differences. The unmodified statement of assurance, that means you have reasonable assurance that the internal controls are effective and you have 0 material weakness. That's an unmodified. And it makes sense. I don't need to do anything, so it's not modified. Then it's an unmodified statement of assurance. The second classification is a modified statement of assurance. It says, we have reasonable assurance that our internal control is effective, but we have some exceptions. We have 1 or more material weakness. And again, material weakness means you have to report it to higher. And then you got to explain it. You got to cite the material weakness in that classification. And then the third classification is statement of no assurance. That provides that no assurance can be provided. I have not seen an organization that actually reported no assurance because nobody wants to look bad, right? And internal controls are effective because few or no assessments were conducted. That's saying you didn't do your job. The noted material weaknesses are pervasive across many key operations. We cannot pinpoint what the issue is, so we didn't do any assessment, or the IFMS is substantially non-compliant with federal requirements. That's the integrated FM systems, financial management system. So I don't know. Has anyone, maybe I should ask, does anyone have seen anyone write down a statement of no assurance or report a statement of no assurance? And then, all right. All right, so the next few charts kind of give you some definitions. Yeah. Let's see, accessible units, unit managers, control objective, control technique. These are all pretty straightforward. So I'm just looking, I don't have any highlights on them. Just making sure reasonable assurance. On page 33, we went through risk appetite, risk profile versus the other ones not in here, the risk register. It's just registering the risk. But the profile is the most significant risk versus the risk register is just a compiling of all the risks that's been identified. Oh, that was fast. Okay, well, that looks like we are at the end of CDFM Module 1, Competency 3. What are your questions? Actually, about anything that we've covered so far for the last 3 weeks. Take these glasses off so I can see you.
Good question, ma'am.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I just have a question regarding the unmodified statement assurance and modified statement assurance. Those
Okay.
three categories.
Uh-huh.
As far as the level of threat, which one is the highest one? That would be statement assurance or unmodified?
Well, the last one was statement of no assurance.
Statement
So
no assurance.
they're in order. So unmodified is mostly what most people have. Is unmodified statement of assurance. We have all our internal control measures are in place, and we have reasonable assurance that our processes are working good. We have no material weakness. So the best one is unmodified statement of assurance. Then the middle is the modified, and then you have statement of no assurance. That's the one I said not too many agencies that I've run into will actually say the third one, because they've tried to exhaust measures to ensure that they don't have to report this annually. So this is at the DoD level. Does that answer your questions, Davis?
Yes, ma'am. I do appreciate it.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, looks like we have no other questions. All right, so I think next week now we're going to cover module 3.1, which is fiscal law. Because again, fiscal law accounts for the majority of the questions, even on the module 1 exam. So please review module 1, competency 1, 2, and 3, and make sure you read through the material, like the story, being able to talk about it, ask yourself questions, just like when I went over the Federal Managers Financial Integrity Act of 1982. I went over that extensively, but by the time I got to the end of the page, some of you forgot about it. So that's why I say repetition, repetition, repetition. You got to keep going over it, making sure you could tie it back to information as you go into new information. You need to understand that you can't forget about what you just studied 10, 15 minutes ago. All right. If there's nothing else, I will see you all next week. So this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. Wait, I see a hand. Go ahead. I was closing it in.
I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am. I know this may be a stupid question,
No. Don't
so
do
now
it.
going back to the authorization process. So I'm
Okay.
trying to tie things into our current event that's going on right now.
Okay.
So we have a bill that has been signed by the president. And so now it needs to come down the channels, I guess, before it gets to us, because we have to have that appropriations bill, the appropriations, in order to execute funding.
Correct.
And I know a lot of times we get questions, we'll say, somebody will say, well, like the bill has been signed by the president and we have money from the current CR. How come we can't spend that money now to go beyond the current CR, if it makes sense?
Right. So a couple of things there. So the CR is your rules, your guidelines. That's what's restricting you from spending. It don't. It's kind of like, oh, so and so is gonna pay me $100 next week, so I'm gonna start spending because they're gonna no. You're gonna spend what you have. So CR, you're gonna spend what you have. And authorization, remember, that goes through one process. Once that's signed, that just says the DoD can do these programs. That's it. And now you got to wait, like we operating on the CR till March, which is crazy. And then the fiscal year ends in September. But anyway, that's neither here or there. And then the appropriation bill has to then be signed for us to actually receive FY24 funding. Does that make sense? Hopefully I didn't.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, no question is a stupid question, because again, if you don't work at those levels, it's kind of difficult to see the integral details of what they're doing. Because you might just say, like you say, Congress has sign pass on the bill to the president sign it. You got to ask, which bill did they sign? Oh, you'll be like, authorization bill. Okay, well, that still don't give me any money. So I still can't operate. And even if they appropriate the funds, you still don't have any money until your allotment trickles down to you, because it might be less. They might cut it by the time it gets to you anyway. And so, all right. Any other questions? Going once, going twice. Thank you all so much for stopping by. I welcome the input, because it kind of helps me to dig a little deeper into the information. So don't feel like if I don't know it, I'm not going to stumble and tell you the wrong thing, because I want you all to be successful on the exam. All right, this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. I'll see you guys again next time. Thank you all for stopping by.